Thank you, Enek. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robin Huguenot-Noël. I work for the European Policy Center as a policy analyst on economic governance, and I've got the pleasure of chairing this session this afternoon on making the EU work for everyone. I assume you probably know some of our speakers, if not all of them, because they are, the most progressive voices on economic governance reforms, and it's, not always very easy to find very progressive voices on EMU. So it's, I'm just going to introduce them very quickly. But Maria João Rodrigues, who's on my right, president of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, also vice president of the S&D Group in the European Parliament. Udo Bullmann, that is here on my left. Also Vice President of the S&D Group and distinguished member of the European Parliament, and László Andor, who is here, former Commissioner for Employment and Social Inclusion, currently also working as a professor in Berlin at the Hertie School of Governance, as a Mercator Senior Fellow. If I'm right. Before we start, just to remind you that there is the hashtag here, fair growth. It's also a way for the conference to also share the discussions with everyone out there in the digital economy that you all know well about. So feel free to tweet here. But now that to start with, just introducing a bit the debate and coming back to the first PES video that was shown this morning, bringing it to the EMU debate that seems quite technical at first glance into a more current issues. I think to give you a little bit of historical background, one thing. We had the EMU being introduced about 25 years ago with the Maastricht Treaty. After in the 90s, everything was working pretty well, growth and employment, and basically there was the feeling in the general population that the euro did work for everyone somehow. And then we, in the wake of a financial crisis, then that leads to a kind of poly-crisis, which includes an economic crisis, a social crisis, political crisis. And that is, pretty much fixed. On the EMU is pretty much fixed as a result, but there is still a certain feeling of skepticism towards the Euro project. And I think that's one of the issues that we will be debating today. I mean, how to rebuild trust in the EMU project. And I'm turning to you, Maria, because you're also very much known as the mother of a Lisbon strategy. So the EU growth strategy that was basically looking at qualitative, how to make qualitative growth also part of a debate on economic governance. And I think if there is one big question today, when we talk about EMU deepening, which is something again that sounds a bit technical at the first glance, what do we mean by EMU deepening, and how do you think that it can lead to qualitative economic development? And what are the challenges for that today?
Very well. So good afternoon, everybody. And this is a pleasure to join a panel with such good friends. And we work together in many occasions to reshape this economic and monetary union. I like very much your take because, in fact, my assumption is that now we are approaching a big moment to reform the economic and monetary union. After long years of crisis and many years of putting on the table possible proposals, with many political differences across the European landscape. But now, if you see the political calendar, we know two things: that a roadmap to change the kind of Europe we have is now put on the table. For us, progressive, this is a great opportunity really to reshape Europe. And we don't need to wait for European elections for this. And of course, one of the key topics is the future of our common monetary zone. Well, the schedule is quite tight. The clocks are already ticking because on the 15th of December, we'll have a Euro summit. Before that, the European Commission will adopt a big package to reform EMU on the 6th of December. Before that, the Ministers of Finance will also come with their proposal on the 4th of December. And before that, we progressives in Lisbon in the PES Council, we also adopt our blueprint to reform the eurozone. So we are really coming to decisive moments. And this is a kind of a window of opportunity. Because after that, I believe that, let's see what comes from Germany, but the risk we will have a pretty conservative government in Germany, this will complicate things. So let's use this window of opportunity. We have on the table, again, coming from the conservative side, an agenda to reform EMU, which is focusing on a key word, which is stability. It's a kind of sacred cow in the European politics. But let me tell you, of course, we are concerned about stability in the sense of avoiding too high inflation or too high public deficits and debt. Of course, we are also worried about responsible finance. But our main concern for us progressives is to foster growth and a new kind of growth. So this is your take, okay? And this is something sometimes forgotten for those who are so-called experts of the economic and monetary union. Let's never forget that our main compass to drive this reform is, of course, to promote growth, jobs, better jobs, and a new kind of growth, which should now be driven by sustainable development goals. So this means, first of all, that now we are preparing something important called social pillar to update social standards. This should have consequences for the way we reshape the eurozone, because the economic and monetary union should create conditions for all countries participating to upgrade the social standards of their citizens. This is the first concern. Secondly, we need to promote investment towards greener growth and smart growth, making the best of the current digital revolution. And this means a lot of investment. And we still have a big investment gap in Europe. So the key word to drive the reform should be, in fact, growth in the sense of sustainable development. But there is a second key word, which is convergence. Because so far, the eurozone has been working as a big machinery for divergence. So we need to stop this. Many jobs, many viable companies, SMEs, were destroyed because of that. So we need to stop this. And this means that all member states should have the possibility to invest, private, public, to create these jobs of the future. This means also that the eurozone needs to provide the real possibilities as all the other monetary zones in the world, and this depends on having a fiscal capacity. Yes, we do need to build up a fiscal capacity in the eurozone. And I'm completely in favor of including this in the community budget, because we need to make sure that this fiscal capacity will be conducted in democratic terms. So we need to have a proper involvement of the European Parliament, also the national parliaments, making sure that this new instrument will be there to support, to upgrade citizens' lives and the right kind of investments. So our key words to conclude are growth, sustainable development, convergence, and democracy. So this makes a progressive agenda to reform the eurozone.
Thank you very much. Udo, I'm turning to you, very much investment expert. You've been working on FC, you've been working on also the potential proposals for Eurozone budgets or any kind of fiscal capacity. And at the moment, we hear that there is more and more momentum for some of the proposals that have been presented by the PES for years, for decades now. And we look at, the potential emergence of a fiscal capacity. The issue is when you look at what a Eurozone budget means on the German side, when you look at what it means on the French side, it does mean very different things. And even turning the issue of turning the current ESM mechanism into a European monetary fund, can also be looked at, from more of a, again, stability focus only, and not necessarily the kind of long-term investments. So how do we ensure that now that there is this momentum, we can shift the narrative into something that looks a bit more at long-term investments and not only at the resilience of the EMU that is as important?
Thanks, Robin, for this excellent question. Does the machine work? You understand me? Yes. Okay, good. So, perfect question. Yes, we are in the situation of the right momentum. I agree to everything what Maria just said, which is not by accident, because we are doing a lot of hopefully good work together day by day and also in principle questions. To be provocative for the first round, before we get into any specifics, it's not too easy to make use of this chance. And I would warn us against one deadlock, one situation in which we do not have, I guess, any chance to turn the page. First round, allow me that I pick the question up from a different angle. Ordinary people think, more and more, Europe does not deliver. Europe did not deliver during the last decades. And protagonists of the right on national level very often make abuse of this prejudice or of this analysis by saying, okay, let's go back the national path, let's go back, only the nation state is able to organize our survival. You have that in the West, you have that in the East, you have it in the North, and you have it in the South. A major problem for the progressives, because they are somehow right. Europe did not deliver sufficiently, but they draw and they sell the wrong conclusion. There is no way out of a modern, highly complex world going back to the resources of the nation state alone, because nation state will not deliver, will not have any chance to solve modern problems, highly complex as climate change, as refugee problems, as the growing divide between the rich and the poor worldwide, etc., etc. But if we now go into the trap to pick the central issues up as institutional questions, we will lose. Because then they look at the different proposals. Half of the population thinks there is no good with Europe. The other half thinks, well, we heard so much. There is something by Macron, there is something by Juncker, there is something by Tusk. And now our good friend Wolfgang Schäuble came up. And the conservatives are always on the safe side because they say, well, Europe is a danger. It did not deliver in the past, so why give them too much now? And good Wolfgang will always be the winner of the argument by saying, let's keep in control of what we are doing. And then we are on the intergovernmental page, which is by far not enough, which is the wrong answer. But we are lost as soon as we get into this debate as an institutional debate. Because then it's only something for experts, for highly specified people in the universities, in politics, etc., etc. My proposal is that we turn the page by doing something else, by having a different exercise. We have to define what we are fighting for. What is the real problem in Europe? We have a changing labor market. Do we have unions tomorrow? In a more and more individualized situation in the labor market? We were talking in the panel before about it was called like those people who think that they are employers, but they are backward in the situation of bloody capitalism in a modern world. So this is a fake news, this is a lie. Do we still have collective bargaining? Do we still have collective representation of workforces? How do we organize that? 11 million kids all over Europe without proper nutrition, without proper shelter, without proper housing. What are we doing against that? Are we prepared? Is our European politics system, are the national politics system prepared to tackle that, to fight against that, to give a perspective to the young generation, especially in societies where half of them are unemployed and cannot see any forward. So what about the 11 million young people without a job, without a qualification, more than residents in Belgium? This is a whole lot of a population of the next generation. How can they organize their family life in their next generation? How can they organize a decent pension? How can they contribute to society? Let's start, friends, with these questions. And let's give the answer, first of all. This bloody neoliberalism was not able to solve these kind of problems. Quite the opposite. They run us into a disaster. So their answers are not valuable anymore. And now we have to take a new approach, and we have to develop a new holistic system of policy making, a new narrative where growth is not a goal in itself anymore, but growth has to serve the interests of ordinary people. We are not only tackling a small issue of environmental problems, it's climate change and more. We are at the substance of the perspective of this globe. So we have to fight and we have to argue for a new model of economics, for a new model of economic and social life, where we have mutually supportive strategies for decent work and full employment, for sustainable growth and sustainability all over in our personal environmental life. So this is the old narrative, and so far your introduction was well done. This was the start of the Lisbon strategy, Maria, where we said, where you argued and others argued for mutually supportive strategies in our day-to-day politics. But it never lived up to the capacities of Lisbon. We fall short against what was possible, and now we have to re-establish a new model which is convincing enough to mobilize people. And then we enter into institutional debate. From there we go and say, who's going to serve that? Who is going to achieve that? We need not a finance minister in Europe because we would like to have a new job here. We need a finance minister because it's not feasible anymore with 19 guys to save us against the crisis. It's not possible to react to markets overnight with 19 decision-making bodies. We need a body in Europe like a finance minister, a budget, etc., to tackle the substantial questions of the next generation. This is the way I would propose in which we argue. Otherwise, I cannot see that we can make full use of our chances ahead. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Broadening the debate, and actually to come back to what Maria was saying a bit earlier, as one of the two priorities being convergence. And you know, again, this is something that the PES has been arguing for decades, the idea of a convergence code and so on. And I'm turning to you now, László, because I also know that you have been showing and also in your academic work very, very significantly all the kind of social and economic divergences that were happening as a result of the economic crisis. And it's been, you know, part of the debate all throughout the day. There was on one side, you know, the idea that there is a need for a eurozone budget, there is a need to kind of further, to push the integration and to have some kind of eurozone avant-garde. But at the same time, on the other side, we look at the question of convergence, divergence, and is there not a risk, and I'm asking you also as our representative of Central and Eastern Europe on the panel, is there not a risk that this Eurozone avant-garde also leads to further divergence, both, you know, economic divergence, social divergence, but also potentially political divergence?
Well, thank you very much for these interesting questions, and first of all for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel, and I'm sure some of you expect me to discuss unemployment insurance. That is a very important component of the Eurozone reform, but indeed the question Robin just raised is fascinating. We got used to discussing the Eurozone problems as a north-south problem, a north-south polarization and divergence, but let's just spend a few minutes on discussing this issue as an east-west question, because there is a very interesting east-west dimension also of the functioning of the single currency and the possibility of the eurozone enlargement. In other words, a reunification of the European Union and the eurozone, because that was the original idea. The original idea 25 years ago was not to create a separation, but to create a single market, which is also served for the sake of stability by a single currency. And the British opt-out was the first, which opened up a separation. And now that the United Kingdom is supposedly leaving the European Union, this question comes back. The possibility of reuniting these two projects is coming back. And what Mr. Juncker released in the latest State of the Union message indeed is a sign of this intention, that let's reunite this project. But then the question is whether it was only the British opt-out, which is a legal thing, blocking the unifying mission of the euro, or there are other political economic aspects also of the functioning of the single currency which are blocking this. If you just look at the legal aspect, now we have an opportunity. Now we have an opportunity, and we have to somehow encourage the countries of Central Eastern Europe. Sometimes you still call them the new member states, you can say the Eastern member states, and say that, you know, with different speed, they already started to join the eurozone, and those who are still lagging behind could be somehow encouraged, incentivized to do so, and then once everybody inside the eurozone, Denmark is another question, we would live happily ever after. And of course, this is a bit of a simplistic view. First of all, I think we need to categorize the so-called Eastern countries in order to understand better their specific situations and their relations to the Euro challenge, and then see what needs to be done, not just legally, but also economically, for making this reunification possible. To categorize, and I admit that every categorization implies some simplification, but there are basically three groups. There's the group of the Eastern EU member states, which are already inside the Eurozone. That's 5 countries, Slovenia, Slovakia, and the 3 Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And I will call them the group of the strong and stable. Strong and stable. They already managed relatively quickly to perform all the Maastricht criteria, and they are part of the Eurozone, enjoying also the stability which comes with it. But the remaining countries should be split into 2 groups. One which is Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia, and I will call them the weak and stable. And because they are stable, they know that this discipline is paying off for them, and they are considering more concretely an approach to the entry, maybe not with a tight deadline, but they are relatively close to setting a deadline for themselves to join. And then there is the remaining 3 countries, Poland, Czech Republic, and last but not least Hungary, which is the strong and unstable. And this group, of course, because of the size, the relatively larger size of their economies, more diversified profile of the economy, they, in the recent years, to some extent, also enjoyed the freedom of exchange rate adjustment. And obviously, they're more reluctant, despite the legal obligation, they're more reluctant to choose a fast track towards the Eurozone. Now, what are the conditions for encouraging, helping this group into the Eurozone and making this reunification possible? In my view, the number 1 condition is interpretation. And by interpretation, I do not mean the languages, but I do mean that literally the majority of the Eurozone member states did not fulfill the Maastricht criteria when they became Eurozone members. This is the reality. Of course, there have been some extreme cases like Greece, but also Belgium, but also Italy. So if you look at all the Maastricht criteria, the majority did not fulfill the Maastricht criteria at the time of the entry. It happened because of interpretation. And interpretation was more generous with the Western countries than with the Eastern countries once Lithuania was rejected on a tiny, minuscule inflation differential. So more discipline was expected from the Eastern countries than from the Western countries. I'm afraid this is true. So some kind of clarity and consistency needs to be created. The other one is support. And Mr. Juncker, in his State of the Union message, indeed is offering some support, some incentivization in the form of a new EU fund inside the EU budget. But I think once we speak about support, it's very important to state that it cannot happen at the expense of the existing cohesion funding. Cohesion funding, cohesion policy has its mission. It is about helping the low-income regions, and you find the poorest regions in Eastern Poland, Eastern Slovakia, Eastern Hungary, Eastern Romania, Eastern Bulgaria. And it cannot happen that any kind of eurozone budget line would be created at the expense of supporting these poorest regions of the European Union, which need this significant support for investment, including social investment, to perform at an acceptable level in the single market. And then we come to the points raised by Maria and Udo, the necessary reform of the Eurozone. Because of the shortness of the time, let me just refer to a former Polish Prime Minister I heard in a conference who said that as long as internal devaluation is the only game in town, we are not going to join. As simple as that. So if there is no instrument in the Eurozone architecture to deal with asymmetric shocks apart from internal devaluation, we are not all Latvia. I'm sorry. We need to have social standards. We can't absorb 15% cuts in wages and pensions. This is not going to be a way to integrate countries. And of course, this shouldn't be the destiny of the southern European countries either, but those still outside have a greater room for maneuver to decide whether they want to join quickly. And of course, the speed of the Eurozone reform will have to play a role. We also need to decide, once speaking about the East, whether the Maastricht criteria are more important than the Copenhagen criteria. Until now, I'm afraid there has been a sad tacit deal that if you comply with the Maastricht idea, you keep your deficit low, there's no problem if you don't comply with the Copenhagen criteria, what comes to the political side. I think we have to set the priorities right. We have to set the priorities right. I think the Copenhagen criteria should be more important than the Maastricht criteria, and we also need a reform of the Maastricht criteria to make them smarter. And the final point, because of the expectations, to make at least one point about unemployment insurance. In the recent years, of course, we have been discussing this a lot, and I also had to answer on many occasions the question, what is the right sequencing? When exactly this should come? What kind of preconditions exist? And I came to a conclusion which obviously I didn't think and I didn't say several years ago, but my answer to the sequencing is that in reality the unemployment insurance should have come at the very, very beginning of the Eurozone reform. Why? Because as it looks, as it is happening in the practice, this experience with a single currency is an extraordinary experiment with people. When we left the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet orbit, we thought that there would be no more experimentation with people. I think what we witness in this very incomplete monetary union with a very incremental, very slow motion reform process is an experimentation with people. And I think it's the most vulnerable people, the unemployed, the long-term unemployed, are paying the price, the unemployed young people who in many cases just don't have a new opportunity in the country where they live and they have to accept very precarious situations if they want the first job. So this experiment, I'm afraid, is costing a lot for the European Union, socially, but also in terms of political capital. And I very much hope that in the post-Schäuble era, there would be a possibility to move ahead with such a safety net relatively quickly.
Thank you, László. Before I actually jump on one of your points, just to let you know that we will be opening the floor to questions as well. So feel free to kind of start already preparing. It's a quite amazing opportunity to have such great speakers on the panel. So feel free to already have some thoughts about what you would like to raise. Just a follow-up question on that. You were mentioning, László, the political sustainability of a project. And I think one of the elements that we've seen popping up throughout the day is also the question of not only reunification between the West and the East, but also between the winners and losers. And winners and losers very often is portrayed as winners and losers of globalization. I would say perhaps it's a bit fair to say of the knowledge economy. At least one of the elements that is quite important is the fact that it is for purely economic purposes more interesting to have some agglomeration effects coming in where you would have innovation being pursued and so on. At the same time, it does have quite an important geographical or social cost on some of the people being widespread on the continent. So my questions to you is how can we reconcile this kind of very political economic question? How do we make economic integration and these effects also politically sustainable? And that's really a question for the three of you. And then again, if you can be quite short in your responses so that we can also then allow the floor to jump in.
In fact, this is a great question because we are here to develop a progressive approach. So let me give my hint about this. The big challenge for us progressives is to make the best of innovation because we are people open to the future. So we really want innovation of different kinds, economic, social, technological, but to shape it in such a way that we improve our way of life and for all people, all citizens. So we need to find a way to have a good synergy all the time between innovation on one hand and sustainable development on the other hand. So these are the two poles we need to combine all over. When it comes to the eurozone, this has implications. Because I'd like to come back to the question raised by László about the sequencing. We are now inventing something new. All the history of European integration is inventing something new every day. Now we are finding the way to use a monetary zone to include everybody in the opportunity to have access to sustainable development. So this is the issue. And the sequence matters. In all the creations of history, the sequencing matters. For us progressives, of course, we should start from the social by saying we want to make sure that everybody in this eurozone has a real chance to improve their life. And so, from my viewpoint, we are right now, by the way, in the good sequence because we are supposed to adopt the social pillar in November, and then we should use the social pillar to shape economic governance and to shape big decisions coming on the EMU. So we are in the right track. Let's use this. And for a second reason, László also referred, which is also a big choice for progressives, is the eurozone to be conceived as a club, a closed club, or are we in favor of an inclusive approach for the eurozone? And we need to define our position quick. I'm pretty in favor of using eurozone in an open way and creating conditions for all member states willing to join if they meet the criteria to join. So that's why I'm in favor of this pre-accession instrument which was announced. But I also must say that we need to create an instrument to help the member states who are already in the eurozone also to converge. The two things are necessary.
Thank you. Udo, you wanted to...
Yes, I would say education is key and research is key, but both are not the only keys. Don't forget when the crisis hit on Spain, for example, and this is only an example, half of the next generation without a job. The crisis hit on perhaps the best qualified young people the country had ever seen. So this is why I say it's not the only key. If you oblige austerity politics on countries which need positive development, investment, then you cause a crisis of an even higher dimension because you have a very qualified workforce in the next generation, but you give the signal, we don't use this qualification, we don't need you. What an economic disaster, what a political disaster, what a social and individual disaster. So, I very much advocate holistic, what Maria calls holistic solutions, because in accordance to improving education systems, in accordance to giving more resources for research and development, we have to renovate our system of economic policy making. We need a, you can call it a business model, an economic policy business model for the South. We need an economic policy business model for the East. If we are a big entity, a big market of close to 500 million people, which will share their future because they buy more than 90% of their goods and services internally, everybody has to have the capacity to participate. That means each and any region, but all individuals as well. So we have to develop policies on the European level, on the national level, on the regional level, and in the municipalities that are, again, I use the word mutually supportive, that produce synergies. And from here you can draw a whole lot of consequences. Of course, there has to be somehow a positive share of work. Not each and any country in an entity of 500 million can have a balance sheet that is net exporting to the others. Only for mathematical reasons that will not be possible, even if Wolfgang told us like that always. Yeah, it's not feasible to organize that. If you have an area in the Mediterranean full of cultural richness, full of necessary functions, once you would like to bridge the situation between continents, between different religions, between different approaches to state building, or whatever you would like to call it. If you see all that crisis in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, if you see the situation in Turkey, then we have to invest in the South, in the marketplaces, intellectual and productive marketplaces of the South, to make them new, challenging and interesting locations of finding new solutions, and not to neglect their potential. And all the different layers have to contribute to that. The same in the East, in the Baltic area, in the old traditional cultural areas of Central Europe. We have to renovate them. And if we do not find to this positive, holistic approach of a new sustainable economic policy model that needs each and everybody, we will fail. And this business model has to be discussed. These functions have to be discussed, serving the best interest of ordinary people. And from there we should derive institutional alterations which we are pushing for. Then we have a chance again, then we have a chance, if you put it like that, to win the argument and to win elections. László was talking about the post-Schäuble area. Before you are very enthusiastic about that, we do not know what is going to come, to be blunt on that. Schäuble had the disadvantage, if you're allowed to comment on that as German representative, Schäuble had the disadvantage that neither him nor his experts had any clue or concept about economics. So this was the real problem. But he was an enthusiastic, or he is an enthusiastic European. You can fancy worse than that. You can have people coming in having no clue from economics and being anti-European. This is worse than Schäuble. So wait and see, hope for the best, and the fight is going to restart. It is not over.
László, very quickly, what should be Europe's business model, EMU's business model?
I'm biased for the documents which we produced in 2012, the blueprint and all these. I think there was a lot of explicit language, and what we witnessed in the meantime is a transition to a lot of euphemisms. So we don't say Eurobond anymore, we say safe assets. We say, stabilization function instead of unemployment insurance. We say fiscal capacity instead of eurozone budget. But people need to learn how to read between the lines. And I'm not from the eurozone. For me, it's quite easy to say the word transfers. But at the end of the day, let's be honest. If we fail to sell the necessity of transfers to the electorate, then we have to think about going backwards rather than forward. It's just, I think, elementary that in a single market, the high-income regions need to support the low-income regions, and in a monetary union, the surplus countries have to support the deficit countries. And if it cannot be solved for political reasons, then we have to prepare for a disorderly disintegration of the eurozone, which is going to be very, very ugly.
Thank you, László. I'm opening the floor to questions. I'm also very much aware of time, so I'm going to be able to take three. A lady here. I've got another participation there. And a third one over there. Yeah, you please.
Yes. Hello, thank you. So my name is Ariane, I work at the College of Europe, and I wanted to build up a bit on the last point you were mentioning. I was thinking one of the main triggers, I would say, of the euro crisis was the competitiveness factor and how peripheral countries were running commercial deficits, like chronic commercial deficits. And some things have been done about this, but I wouldn't say that a lot has been done. So how would you say that a new EMU or that a reformed EMU should tackle this situation where credit, if things go well again, would start flowing again and those deficits may get repeated? How do you think this could be tackled?
Thank you. So a question on competitiveness. Yeah, your neighbor was...
Thank you. Yes, Andrew Watt from the IMK in Germany, part of the Hans Böckler Foundation. I think there are two fairly clear visions now for the development of EMU. One is the Schäuble vision that Udo Bullmann's referred to. I have a question about that. Is the PS or the Social Democratic family at the European level clear that they reject this idea of state insolvency, which is essentially the key element in that German vision? And if so, is there a sufficient political majority to block that? And the other vision is, if you like, the one coming out of the European institutions that for some years now emphasized by Macron and others, and of course by the Social Democratic family, which involves various risk-sharing elements. And I think if the Germans are right about one thing, if you have that, then you need to also have some control on member state policies, fiscal policies in particular. My question there is the PS, is the S&D willing to go down that road? Is it willing to accept constraints on national fiscal policy? And if so, how should they work?
Thank you very much. State insolvency, should we, can we? And yeah, a last question over there was a...
Yes, hello, my name is Mathieu. I'm working at the Socialist Group in the Committee of the Regions, and I have a question in particular to Maria João. Maria João said that she supported the option of having the fiscal capacity within the eurozone budget. And I was wondering, which I understand is in line with the Parliament's request to have a democratic control over that budget. But still, if you have it within the EU budget, that means that the fiscal capacity could only go up until the ceiling of the EU budget of 123% of RNB, of revenue, while it is currently at 1%, which means that your fiscal capacity would be at best of 0.23% of the EU budget. And don't you also see a risk for a crowding out effect on already existing EU programs? First question. I have a very little second. My other question is, what would you do with these 0.23% of fiscal capacity? Because we have the Schäuble, the German vision, I mean not Udo's, but Wolfgang's vision of structural reform funding. I mean of reform towards structural reforms. And could you, for instance, imagine that that eurozone budget would be used to help Mr. Macron to finance his so-called structural reform on the reform of revenues in France? I mean, where do you draw the line of structural reforms in terms of progressive definition of structural reforms?
Thank you very much. Just to clarify one point that you raised, so crowding out, just for everyone in the room, means when you have public intervention and that drives out basically private investment that would have occurred in any way. So, but then we have 4 questions in total, just reminding them, and I'm going to start with you, Maria, because you were directly mentioned as well. But competitiveness, the question as to, to what extent should fiscal capacity also look, or Eurozone budget also look at the issue of competitiveness. Then the question again of on state insolvency, should we defend it as a political family? Can we also do that? A question on fiscal capacity that was, I mean, again, on kind of twofold, crowding out, to what extent may it crowd out investment, private investment, and the question of conditionality. So should basically EU or Eurozone budget be conditioned to some kind of structural reforms, or should it kind of be used as a positive incentive to conduct structural reforms? So I'll leave you with the 4 questions, and I'm going to start with you, Maria.
Well, many thanks, because these are indeed very important questions. Let me take the first one. Let me be clear. Of course, we want European countries to be competitive on a good basis. I mean, to be competitive on a good basis means, first of all, to respect the standards of sustainable development. This is the best competitive advantage we can have with a long-term perspective. So all member states should have the opportunity to invest in sustainable development, that's for sure. Nevertheless, let me be clear. I don't consider that to run a big surplus against other European countries or against the world is the best indicator of competitiveness. Europe so far has a huge surplus against the world economy. And the standard set by Mr. Schäuble that all member states of the eurozone should run a surplus is completely irrational. Because our partners all over the world, of course, are complaining. We can see these in G20, they are complaining, and rightly so. So to run a surplus is not necessarily the best indicator of having a fitted economy. And then we have a second problem, which is the macroeconomic imbalances inside the eurozone. Because let me be clear, yes, we do have imbalances, but there are 2 ways of reducing these imbalances. Either you ask the less competitive countries to squeeze themselves, cutting wages, pensions, to reduce labor costs in order to become more competitive. And then, yes, they can run a surplus, but with a huge social cost. So this is one way to reduce imbalances And this happened over the last years with the so-called Troika programs. We cannot accept this road to reduce the imbalances. On the other hand, we progressives, we want the most competitive countries to give their contribution. How? How can they make this contribution? Well, by raising their internal wages, by investing more in their countries, and like that, by absorbing exports coming from the others. This is the progressive way, this is the win-win way to reduce imbalances. So there is a clear-cut difference on the way to be competitive. We want member states to be competitive, but not by cutting wages or pensions. Let me be clear. Then, on the instruments which are now being floated for the upcoming decisions on reforming EMU. Let me again be clear. In the Schäuble agenda, we do have this suggestion that debt restructuring instrument, whenever there are doubts about debt sustainability, could create a kind of permanent discipline on public finances. Let me tell you, this is an extremely risky, in fact, dangerous solution. Because these will just excite financial markets to speculate against member states whenever there is some kind of problem in the public debt. Of course, we need to have sustainable public finances. But don't use this crazy weapon. This is completely self-defeating, as we saw in the past. So we cannot accept this. But then, of course, coming back to the issue, how can we have responsible public finances? I do recognize that in a monetary zone, we need to have common fiscal discipline. Yes, we do. Even I believe that we should have a much smarter common discipline, enabling for us to have the room to invest. This needs to be changed. But because there are limits for national expenditure, exactly because you have a common fiscal discipline, that's exactly why we need to build up a fiscal capacity in the eurozone. And now I come to the last question, what kind of fiscal capacity? And I think after many years of coming up with expertise, it's clear that we do need an instrument for stabilization, focusing on investment or European employment insurance. We need an instrument to support convergence inside the eurozone. And yes, as I said some minutes ago, I agree with an instrument to support the pre-ins, those who want to join and need to converge. This is necessary under a condition which is the crowding not undermining critical programs we need to have for European Union as a whole, cohesion programs, a good program for research and development, a good program also for defense, this is necessary. So this brings us to the last question. That's for sure that if the European Union wants to meet the current challenges, regional convergence, a fair eurozone, dealing with the external challenges, including refugees, defense, development, and so on, of course we need a bigger budget. Let me be clear, we need a bigger budget. And this is a case for European sovereignty. I like this concept. Because once and for all, we need to show to the nationalistic parties they are completely wrong when they say that now the best solution is to go back to national borders. This is a complete illusion. If we Europeans, we want to take control of our lives, we need to count on the European dimension, and of course we need to have a bigger budget, which means how can we finance? This is my last point. We need to go for own resources. We need once and for all to accept that we need new own resources. The financial transaction, the carbon tax, and now the digital tax. So these are three very precise solutions for Europeans to have the resources they need to have.
Thank you, Maria. You both have about 2 minutes each, so feel free to take some of the questions.
Robin, I tried to speed up as good as possible. First on Ryan and competitiveness, I think we have to readjust the concept of competitiveness. If we believe in our analysis, if we trust our concepts, we have to newly match this very selective concept against the backdrop of our holistic narrative, of our holistic strategy of a sustainable development. Give you an example. You can go to one of the big German car producers, you buy a car, a big SUV, which is highly competitive, highly productively manufactured. You can easily cross the Alps. You can drive 240 kilometers per hour on the German Autobahn. You can occupy the US and the European markets, but most of the people use it to drive to the butchers next door, do their retailing in the urban areas, pollute their municipalities, and have no clue about a modern concept of mobility. So if we stick to these individual indicators of what is productive, what is competitive, we will go further down the road, ruining our planet. I'm pretty convinced. So the idea of competitiveness, of industrial productivity, has to be rematched against the concept of sustainability on the large scale, as well as on the individual scale of the individual good and production scheme. Same applies, by the way, for public administration. If we would like to see our concept of sustainable development realized, we have to rework our structures of public administration. Of course, we have mismatches in not only one member state, in a lot of member states, where that what people expect from their local services or what they expect from their state services in social protection, in the organization of everyday life necessities is by far not adequate, is not appropriate. So this concept of productivity, of competitiveness is a guiding tool, but it has to tell the truth. This is the task ahead for all experts in the area. Andy, if you read the Schäuble paper, non-paper, or whatever you call it, this is already, the elements were well known. It's not too much of a new story. You can read it from two sides. One side is that you say, well, this was the punch from the outgoing German finance minister against Macron, against Juncker, against the Social Democrats in Europe. And he wanted to leave his legacy for intergovernmental solutions. That is one reading, and this is justified, and I read it like that. The reverse side of the coin is somehow even the conservatives have to admit something has to be done. Status quo is not sufficient anymore. So they are intellectually and politically, they are already on the move to somewhere. And now we have to analyze what their patterns, what their ideas are. It is echoed somehow by Regling, by the boss of the ESM. He says, well, in the long run, we should do community method, but in the short run, that is not feasible, so we have to rely on the intergovernmental. And that makes stronger the intergovernmental structures. We have to weaken the Commission, this is the implication. And we have to warn against visions like that. We have to warn against patterns like that, projects like that, because they will not solve our interest in the long run. Are the Social Democrats ready? And for what are they ready? And does it mean that we would like to have a European governance on national finances? I give you an example. Years and years ago, when we did legislation on the last six-pack, on the Stability and Growth Pact, our party group offered an idea which I still think is revolutionary. Pity was that we couldn't find partners in the parliament, neither on the commission side or in the council. We had a clear-cut commitment to more prudence and intelligence in the system by saying, okay, we need to stabilize public finances, but this is not only done by sanctions, it needs also incentives. And why don't we go the path to say, well, here is the agenda of sustainability, and those member states who fulfill and over-fulfill our goals according to the system of the European semester or whatever you call as a benchmark, they will have more freedom to move, they will have more possibility to invest in education, in research, in the future of the next generation, as those who have the old structures in the public, inefficient structures in public administration, backward-looking strategies for energy, etc., etc. So we need to have a clear distinction of forward-looking and backward-looking public policies, and according to that assessment, we have to give incentives for more freedom. And if the European layer would be ready for that, yes, we would fight for that. We are the fighters for this more intelligent system, which should be replacing the old dump, as Brody once said, dump system of fiscal governance in Europe.
Thank you, Udo. To actually come back to one point, I see we have a little bit more time, so it allows me to give you a bit of a wider question, which I'm sure you're gonna like, László. We have a few events coming up in the next few weeks, months, that have been mentioned throughout the day. So the 6th of December is a paper from the Commission. Then there is a 15th of December, the Euro Summit, and then a few months later, the EU budget negotiations, and in 2019, the Spitzenkandidaten campaign coming up. What should, if even the Conservatives are on the move, what should be the S&D priorities in these elements? What should be the PES priorities? What are we fighting for? It gives you a bit of room, huh?
This is a bit of a long question, I'm afraid, all these stations. Of course, we could discuss this not in 15 minutes, but 15 hours probably. Before coming that, just two quick points, because I think it's very interesting what Maria and Udo said about the competitiveness. That in a way, there is a legitimate side of this discussion, but on the other hand, it has also been a bit of a distraction, because what we experienced in the eurozone in the recent years was the lack or even a failure of demand management. Demand is the very important aspect, which I would say from the progressive side we have to bring into the discussions, even if the conservatives don't want to discuss demand at all, and also specifically to discuss what is the role of wages, wage dynamics in creating and maintaining demand in the eurozone. On the other side, there was a question about the structural reforms, and maybe this is also something which connects us with Robin's question about the coming period and what needs to be stressed, that indeed there is a need for many reforms, but with a progressive interpretation. Sometimes when people speak about structural reform, it simply means that various measures which are neither monetary nor fiscal, but need to enhance somehow the productivity of the economies and increase the growth potential. But the problem is that this is very often reduced to some issues which are cost-cutting and very short-sighted. So the more forward-looking possibilities to enhance growth potentials through innovation would need to be not just explained, but also outlined in greater detail. An interesting part of this debate, which I'm sure will come up, and we need to be clear, is the balance, finding the right balance between risk sharing and risk mitigation. I think this is one of the crucial chapters of the Eurozone debate. One side pushes for risk sharing, the other side says, no, first you need all the risk mitigation. Yes, there needs to be a balance between the two, but I think a lot of risk mitigation has already happened. And what we also cannot accept, that the risk mitigation is only about the internal adjustment of the deficit countries, the financial sector regulation, and the eurozone level measures in terms of completing the banking union and making steps forward in that respect, are also the crucial elements of the risk mitigation which we need to advocate.
Thank you very much, László. I see that our next speaker has already arrived, so I think we're going to conclude with a few just elements to basically introduce him to the thinking that was going on around the table today. A few elements that should be taken for the next few months for the progressive family. Comprehensive approach, like a kind of business model for the EMU, I think was one of the elements that was raised. Another element that was very much in line with what our PS president was saying, cohesion for all, and cohesion that should be economic, social, and political cohesion should be essential and a top priority for the next MFF negotiations for the EU budget. Then the question of conditionalities perhaps, but on sustainable development goals. So the idea that if there should be some kind of incentives from the EU budget, they should be based on very clear objectives in the long run. And the last point, sequencing matters. I think that has been stressed quite a few times, and just basically, again, highlighting that the social elements are as important and should come forward when we look at also the economic governance reforms. Thank you very much to our speakers, and yeah, you have the floor.
Dear friends, I have the pleasure to introduce our special guest, who doesn't need much of an introduction, because he's well known around the world and in Europe, of course. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, I thank him for attending our conference, because I believe it will be very inspiring and interesting for all of us to listen to his views on the future of economic development for Europe. This is what we are discussing all day long, from early morning, from a social democratic perspective, because we can see that Europe needs a change. And we have always been saying that. But what kind of change is the big question? And I can tell you that in all our developments in the last months, and I would say even years, we have always sustainable development as an approach in the core of our economic, social, environmental policies, because it really combines them all in many ways. And this is why I was very impressed some months ago when we were together with Professor Sachs at an event organized by the S&D Group in the European Parliament. And he made such an inspiring speech about the role and the importance of sustainable development, and also saying one thing which we do not often recognize. He said, actually, the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been signed by a huge majority of the UN member states, are social democratic goals. And I think we should really promote that. And when we explain the substance of these policies, we should stress that this is our understanding about the future of Europe. So I'm looking forward with great interest towards your special contribution to our discussion exactly from this perspective. Thank you, Professor Sachs.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and honor for me to be here with you. And more than ever, we need each other across the Atlantic also. We have a real crazy person in the White House, a literal clinical case. So we have to take care of each other a little bit. We're doing everything we can to get sorted out on our side. So don't give up on us. But it's a time when we really need some allies and some clear thinking. I would say, as a starting point, that to my mind, social democracy is the most proved beneficial political ideology and political system in the world and in world history, I would say. If you look at who is achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, actually achieving them, actually balancing prosperity, fairness, and environmental sustainability, it's the countries ranked almost by who has had social democratic governance the longest. It's very simple. Now, unfortunately, the Social Democrats are not winning elections on that basis. And so there's one thing of having the legacy and having shaped really remarkable economic successes, and there's another thing about current politics. And there's obviously a big strain, and that also needs to be understood. But every year we make an SDG index, we being the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and every year it starts out, of course, with Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, and Austria and other countries with long social democratic governance and with institutions that are basically, I would say, social democratic in spirit, even if not in current politics, in the sense of universal access to all critical needs, dignity of all work, benefits, paid leave, family time, vacation time for all workers, no matter who, free health care or very low-cost health care, free higher education or very low-cost education, all financed socially with tax collections that are 40 to 50% of GDP, which pay for a decent society and which have proved against the principles of Anglo-Saxon economics that you can have high tax take and very high productive, efficient, cutting-edge, innovative economies at the same time. And that, of course, runs against all of the neoliberal and libertarian ethos that I have to live with every day in the United States, where we collect 31% of GDP in taxes, as opposed to Europe's 40+%. And imagine if Europe had to live with 10 percentage points of GDP less in taxes. You'd have a society that is dysfunctional. You'd have many poor people. You'd have a deeply ingrained poverty trap. You'd have huge inequalities of social mobility. You'd even have rising death rates among parts of the population. Well, the U.S. has all of that right now because we don't have social democracy. I live in the only country in the world that thinks that Ayn Rand is a philosopher, not a lousy novelist. The end result of that is a really, really dysfunctional society. So my starting point in talking with you is don't give up what you have. It actually works the best of anything in the whole world. Starting point. Okay, that's number one. Number two, Europe as a whole is not working very well, both institutionally and the different speeds of Europe and different levels of development and different nature of the European economy. Let me start with that point first. Europe's real problem is not social democracy doesn't work, but that Southern Europe and Eastern Europe don't work as well as Northern Europe. So if Europe were Scandinavia, Germany, Netherlands, you'd say, God, what more do you want from an economy? But, of course, Southern Europe is in crisis, and Eastern Europe is much poorer, and the power of convergence has been weaker than it might have been, except for the countries right on the border. So I was just in Bratislava a few weeks ago. Looks pretty damn good to me. Poland had its best 25 years. It didn't stop a right-wing government from being elected, but it had the best 25 years of development in Poland's hundreds of years of history, mind you. But Romania, Bulgaria, the Balkans, all more complicated. Different levels of development and convergence not really working so well. So that needs a diagnosis. To my mind, the diagnosis is not less social democracy, but actually more innovation and dynamism in those places that are lagging behind. Because why does Northern Europe work so brilliantly? It works brilliantly because it combines all of the social democratic institutions with very high rates of technological innovation and very sophisticated, innovative economies. And why does it do that? Partly because Sweden invests more than 4% of GDP in research and development, for example. And it gets a big prize out of that. It gets to be fair, balanced, high tax, and very technologically dynamic all at the same time. Finland, Norway, all living on technological innovation. I wish I could say the same thing about Central and Eastern Europe right now, but the amount of patenting is much, much lower. The university systems do not deliver right now a startup innovation environment in the same way that in Northern Europe has occurred. And I would say the same thing is certainly true about Greece, Spain, and Southern Italy. We know a big division from Northern Italy. So there's this question that I think is really important is how to make the parts of Europe that are not functioning like Northern Europe look more like Northern Europe, not less like Northern Europe. And the idea that this comes from market liberalization is not true. The big difference of Northern Europe and Central Europe or Northern Europe and Southern Europe is not which one is a more liberal economy. The big difference is who's doing more patenting, who's bringing new products to the market, where is industry and university working closely together, where are the higher rates of research and development taking place. The beauty of Europe, though, to my mind, is that any place you go, certainly in Poland, without question, throughout the Czech Republic, Slovakia, wonderful universities. This is not dealing with, the universities came first from 1300, 1400. These are great established universities, great technological knowledge, or I should say, brilliant people, great sophistication, but not an engine of innovation taking place right now. So my view is that the mistake of the discussion right now is that you don't make Southern Europe catch up to Northern Europe by making it look more like the United States. By tax cuts, by liberalization, by denying benefits, by other things. You make it look more like Northern Europe by focusing on technological innovation. And one of the reasons that I like the Sustainable Development Goals so much is that that gives an agenda. What should technological innovation be about? It should be about resilience of agriculture. It should be about low carbon energy. It should be about efficient materials use. It should be about circular economy. It should be about smart economy. And Europe, by proclivity and by technological base, should not cede the global leadership on these topics to China. It should say, this is our agenda. And it should use that agenda as industrial policy to make sure that not only is innovation being done, but the innovation is dynamic in Southern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, as well as in Northern Europe. So that's how I would view the most basic question of all, is that social democracy works. It produces the most balanced, livable societies in the world. It produces the highest life expectancies. It produces the lowest Gini coefficients of inequality. But it doesn't by itself produce jobs unless there is some technological dynamism attached to it. And there is in northern Italy, but not in southern Italy. There's none in Greece right now. The whole system has been broken. There's very little in Romania, Bulgaria, too little in parts of Poland. So that, to my mind, is the real agenda. And keeping the distinction clear that it's not liberalization per se, because Europe's enough of a market system. That's not the problem. The problem is competitiveness, having what to sell, new products, new dynamism, global competitiveness. And that requires being very sophisticated in technology. I think Europe needs more of a technology policy than it has also. It does not have enough European champions for global competition. There's no great IT company that is the rival of Google, Apple, Amazon, Huawei, Tencent, Alibaba. SAP is the closest, maybe Ericsson, but it's not really global scale competitiveness with the giants. And that also is a weakness from a security point of view, in my view, from Europe's security point of view, which is that Europe needs some champions. Like Airbus, well, it needs champions in information technology, in the large portals as well. And so I would think about an innovation policy, an R&D policy, a sustainable development-oriented policy, trying to get jobs created in the right way through R&D, innovation, competitiveness, not by the kind of naive view, which is counter to Europe's own record, that the way to do that is by breaking the social welfare system. That's not where the problem lies, because the social welfare system is working very well in the most successful economies of Europe. Of course, benefits have to be compatible in some sense with levels of productivity. That is undeniable. You don't want to go broke in the process. But it's not to change from the basic emphasis of a social democratic orientation. That's not the key. It raises another question. Why did the Social Democrats lose elections so much now? You're experts on that. I can only give you a guess, but I would guess that a lot of it really is about the immigration issues and the identity issues, not about the social democracy as a system issues. Because a lot of your right-wing populist parties are actually social democratic, but just for the nation, not for the immigrants. And so that's quite interesting as well. And I think it really is a big question from an electoral point of view. The attack of the left and the losing votes on the left, and it was true in the United States also, is largely about identity, migrants, anti-migrant sentiments, and so forth, and the question and a kind of blame that we're not able to function now because migrants are taking our jobs. In the U.S., it's mostly about Hispanic migration. In Europe, it's mostly about Muslim migration and the Middle East and the refugee crisis and so on, and from Africa. So there's a big sense in both our regions of the other somehow invading, taking over, leaving us in peril, and so on. And I believe the left needs an answer to this that is more than we're nice people and they're not. I really do believe that for one simple reason, which is that there is no way that Europe or the United States could just open its doors, period, and say anyone that wants to come will come, because given the wealth of our two economies, 1 billion people would show up the next day if the door was really open. So there have to be limits, period. And then the question is not limits or not limits and nice or not nice. The question then is, what is the real policy? And I found in the U.S. Democratic Party incapable of defining a policy because anything sounded not nice. And I'd say the same thing more or less in Europe, which is that to not be hateful and xenophobic, the answer is don't be hateful and xenophobic, but that's not a policy that wins elections because it doesn't define what is the actual policy. And so I think that this is really part of the problem electorally, and that from my sense, it really needs to be sorted out. And the starting point of sorting it out for me are two things. One is to say, of course there need to be limits. Are you kidding? We're rich, they're poor, there are billions of poor people. Of course we need a policy. The second thing that needs to be sorted out better, that I think was not sorted out, is where are the refugees coming from? And the answer is they're coming from American wars. And this was not said almost anywhere. So if you look at where the refugees are coming from, they're coming from Afghanistan, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Libya. What do they all have in common? The CIA. They all have in common U.S. wars that have destabilized all of those countries. Most of the time, the U.S. has done it on its own genius. Once in a while, France and the U.K. helped because they have a good tradition of this. And so it was kind of a reunion of the old imperialists and the new imperialists. But the truth is that Europe has paid a heavy price for U.S. wars. But since we're allies, you can't say that. So you're left saying we don't have a refugee policy other than to abide by the Geneva Conventions, rather than saying stop these idiotic wars so that we don't have millions of people lining up to come here, which is the right political answer. It would have made a huge difference. Of course, one thing I need to be clear about, which is not pleasant, but it's clear in my mind. It's the following. Whether you like Bashar al-Assad or not, and I don't know how you could, there's a difference of not liking him and wanting to overthrow him. And to my mind, the U.S. had no right to sign on with Saudi Arabia to try to overthrow Assad in 2011. And that was now 6.5 years ago, and it's been a bloodbath and a disaster. And believe me, almost anything the CIA touches in regime change has been a disaster for the last half century. It's the most incompetent organization in the world in terms of overthrowing anyone. Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, disasters, complete, utter disasters. How does it get away with it? Secrecy. You're not supposed to talk about it in polite company. So it's complete unaccountability also. But the point I'm making is that Europe paid a very heavy price for this, because in around May 2011, at the Saudis' urging, the U.S. signed on to overthrow Assad. And lo and behold, 3 years later, Europe faced a massive refugee crisis that voted out of office the parties of the left. And that really created this populist backlash. And that's the US doing. And it needs to be called out. Now we have really, unfortunately, a literally, clinically pathological person in the presidency. And I don't say that lightly, and it's not a political statement. It's meant as a clinical statement. And this is the opinion of leading psychiatrists and psychologists, and there's a new volume published a few days ago describing this man's clinical malignant narcissism and the threats that it poses to the world. So God knows what will happen now, except hopefully to keep him away from anything dangerous. And that's our main political task for the moment. But from Europe's point of view, you do need an answer to this question. And let me add one more thought then, and maybe if there's time for any comments or questions. Europe needs its own foreign policy, and I believe its own security policy. I think we're past the NATO era, myself. If I were you, I'd look at the US as hopefully a friendly power, but not as your tight ally in everything. God knows exactly what's going to happen to us. We will do our best to get politically realigned and to survive this president. But Europe needs a foreign policy. And the crisis that Europe has gone through with the refugees exemplifies the failure of, or the problem of not having a foreign policy, because Europe was not able to speak with its own voice. And now with Trump on the verge of decertifying Iran, Europe certainly needs its own foreign policy. And to say no, that's unacceptable. That's a danger for the world. It's complete violation of an agreement. Iran has complied with its agreement. It needs to be certified. This is obvious for everybody except one person. There's one crazy person. Even the team around him is trying to figure out how do we handle this guy? So Europe needs to be able to speak clearly right now on these points. And also it needs an industrial policy consistent with that. It also needs an outreach policy that is consistent with this. One of the really striking facts of Europe that I'm sure you really appreciate, but for me, it's a kind of defining aspect of why this is so complicated right now. In 1950, Europe's population, if you take the big definition to the Urals, basically, or you include Russia, Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, Europe's population was around 700 million for broad Europe. And the population of Africa and the Middle East was about 350 million combined. So Europe's population was twice your big neighborhood. Now Europe's population is about 700 million, about the same. And the neighborhood population is now 1.5 billion. So Europe went from being twice the size of the neighborhood to half the size of the neighborhood. And that's where fundamentally the migration pressures come from, which is that you've got a big, big, big neighborhood. There are 1 billion people in Africa now, 1 billion in sub-Saharan Africa, 1.2 billion in all of Africa. And in 1950, there were only 180 million in sub-Saharan Africa. And in the Middle East, also a huge population increase. So this is a major phenomenon. Your neighborhood got more complicated. And Europe's population growth has been very low, basically near zero net, for the last 70 years, actually. So what does that mean? It means, first, more complicated, because if the neighborhood doesn't develop, Europe faces a crisis. If the neighborhood is at war, Europe faces much more of a crisis. And that's what's happened. And so Europe has a major interest in the success of Africa economically, in the success of the Middle East, and in the demographic transition in Africa as well. In sub-Saharan Africa, the population increased 5 times between 1950 and today, from 180 million to about 1 billion. If you look at the forward projections of the United Nations, Africa's population diminishes a little bit, and Europe's population diminishes, and Africa's population in the medium forecast is on a trajectory to reach 4 billion people by 2100. 4 billion. So instead of being 30% more than Europe, maybe it would be 6 times. That's the UN forecast. Why is it like that? Because the fertility rates in Africa remain about 5 per woman right now. Why? Because the girls can't afford to stay in school. Very straightforward. Because only 25% of high school girls are going to school. And when they do go to school, the fertility rate comes way down. They become literate, join the labor force, marry later, have fewer children, work in the cities, and the demographic transition is very fast. So my advice to Africa first and to Europe second is keep the kids in school. It's not so hard. That's why I'm late. I spent the whole morning and afternoon begging the EEAS and the Commission, spend some money on African education. The answer, it's very hard, Professor Sachs. Budgets are tight. It's not one of our listed priorities. I said, are you kidding? What is? So this is strategy. And it's really important. And I'm recommending one particular thing which I want to put on the table, and that is a special fund for secondary education for Africa that is a Africa AU-EU special fund so that all the kids can complete secondary education. I was told that members of the European Parliament don't like special funds. I said, why? They said, well, they don't like them. Anyway, I'm telling you, like them if you don't, because they're really important to get strategic objectives fulfilled. And what you need is strategy on this. And this could be a real breakthrough. So let me close in the following way. First, social democracy is the beating heart of decency on the planet. Honestly, it is the only decent political ideology that says from the get-go, we need economic development, we need it to be fair, and we need it to be green. So don't give up the principles. Second, as in the kind introduction, SDGs are social democratic goals. They're also sustainable development goals. They're really helpful. Europe should achieve them. The whole world should achieve them. They're not a gimmick, and they're not for Europe to help the world. They're for Europe to help itself first and foremost. Get youth unemployment down. Get investments in a renewable energy system for Europe, and all, boost R&D, which is SDG number 9. So these are good goals for Europe to embrace as organizing principles for Europe. Third, the secret to success is investment, not cuts. That's how you build the future, through investment. And public investment has a huge role to play. Fortunately, you're good at collecting taxes. Don't give that up. But invest it in R&D and technology, and when you do have your European-wide investment programs and your R&D programs, really give an extra boost to Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. And especially use the university system of Europe, which is about 1,000 years old, the leading university system of the world, the longest lasting of the world. Boost that, because that's the quality of thinking, knowledge, technology, insight for the future. And bring in a lot more of the Central and Eastern European universities as core participants in the cutting edge research and development, because that will stimulate the jobs in their countries. And then finally, look strategically and make partners with the neighborhood, with your own foreign policy. Europe's development aid should be focused almost entirely now on Africa. But to really help Africa make the breakthrough out of poverty, through the demographic transition, into quality education for all, and into a self-sustaining economy. This will be a huge favor for Africa and a huge favor for Europe as well, because what you don't want is a demographic population boom and poverty bust. And that's the trajectory that will be more likely unless there's a massive forward-looking investment. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sachs, for this very enlightening speech. I am seeing that we are all very glad that we have the chance to have you among us for this conference. And I think that it was really interesting listening to you, and it came at a very timely moment. And also it's close to our heart, all what you were saying about social democracy. So, Professor, very thanks of you for being with us. It was really great to have you with us. And we will continue, and I will invite immediately the following speakers for the last panel of this day of discussion regarding reinventing Europe's economy. So it's making